Good morning. My name's Sarah Cottingham. I work for a organisation called Ambition Institute, and we train teachers over here in the UK. And I also, outside of that work, do some work with schools and organisations about how memory works and how we should think about memory in order to support learning. So today, I want to talk to you about what students need to know about memory. And I know that you think hard about how to get students to use better study methods. So hopefully this should fit into that. My hunch is that if students know how memory works in a little bit more detail and have a better way to think about memory, that they will be more likely to adopt these better study habits as sort of a first step towards that. Obviously, there's lots we need to do to help them to adopt better study habits, but getting them to think differently about memory, I think, is one of those things. So today, we're going to look at memory, we're going to look at meaningful learning, and then we're going to look at forgetting. And we're going to think about how, if we can change the way students think about these things, they may, as I say, adopt these better study habits. So to start with, let's talk about memory. So it's my hunch that a lot of students think about memory as being like a library. What do I mean by that? I mean that I think that a lot of students, and probably a lot of adults, think that we can learn things by just slotting things into our minds, that we kind of will bank the information quite quickly, and that it stays in this kind of inert, static state in our minds. I think that people think that they can then reach into their minds and draw out the memory. And then if they can't do that, that they just sort of give up and think, oh, well, I'm just not very good at that. I can't remember it, so I must not be very good at that particular subject. And I think people think they can take things out of their brains, rifle through them, just like you would with a library book, and then slot them back in, and the information should stay the same. When actually that's not the case. Memory is kind of always changing. So I think there are kind of insidious things that come along with seeing this library metaphor of memory. So I think students will think that information is banked and that they don't need to revisit it. If you see memory as a library, then you just think you can slot information in and it should just be there when you come back to it. If you see memory as a library, then our students will think they should be able to just pull those bits of information off the shelf, and it should feel easy, when actually memory and curating our memories is actually an effortful process. Finally, if we see memory as a library, then we think there's like really nothing we can do to actually change our memories. And if we hear the teacher teach us something and we don't remember it, well, there's nothing we could have done. It's just us being a bit stupid. So I think there are these bad consequences of this library metaphor. What do we want to replace this metaphor with for our students? I think we want to replace it with the metaphor of an ecosystem. So memory is like an ecosystem, or because I said metaphor, memory is an ecosystem. And how does that help us? How does that change the way that students need to view memory? Well, we talked about memory being dynamic. An ecosystem is dynamic. Life forms are changing, they are growing, they are decaying, they are etc. So if we talk about memory like that, it's not this static thing we put onto a shelf. It is dynamic, it is always changing. Therefore, you can think that you've grasped something in my lesson on Wednesday, but by Friday, that has changed, and you need to check back in on your memories to see how strong they are and how much you remember. You can start to see how this would encourage things like retrieval practice and revisiting information. So memory is dynamic and students need to check in on their memories. Secondly, just like in an ecosystem, life forms are adaptive, well, so are our memories. Our memories are also adaptive. They change in relation to the different experiences we give ourselves. So we have the power to create the conditions to help our memories thrive. It's not just like putting a book on the shelf and either we get it or we don't. We can actually work to create the conditions to help our memories thrive. It's within our control. And I think that's important for students to recognise. And thirdly, our memories are interconnected. Just like the life forms in an ecosystem are reliant upon each other, so are our memories. If you change something to one network of memories, if it's connected to another network, that might also change. And it takes effort to curate and change the networks. And that means that learning should be effortful. If it feels easy, we're probably not doing it right. And that's a huge change from the library metaphor, where we feel like students feel like they should be able to take information off the shelves. Actually, to learn something, it should be effortful. Have a look at the kind of a sort of summing up of the key takeaway then from that. So this is a fundamental shift from the library metaphor to the ecosystem metaphor, and thinking about memory as dynamic, adaptive, and connected. But how do we achieve this? How do we achieve kind of stronger memories of things? I want to talk to you about meaningful learning. So meaningful learning comes from a theory called assimilation theory by David Ajibel. And I've been reading about this quite a lot recently. It's a very powerful theory, and it's supported by, I think, a lot of the reading I've done in neuroscience as well. So I think there are some good research underpinnings for thinking that this is the way we want students to learn. So I'm going to talk to you about what meaningful learning is. And I want us to have in mind that if students understand that this is how they should be learning, there are certain things that they need to do. So what do we mean by meaningful learning? Making meaning is the connection between the new information that you're teaching your students, or that they are reading, and their prior knowledge. And the idea behind meaningful learning is essentially that we can't make meaning out of anything we read or encounter unless we connect it to what we already know. I just want to note at this point that as teachers, we can do lots of things to try to support this process, and we should. However, meaning is made in the minds of our learners. So they have to take some responsibility, and they have to be motivated to learn meaningfully. And that's where their understanding of memory comes in. The meaningful and rote learning continuum is important to recognise for students. So rote learning at one end is just trying to memorise something over and over again, usually verbatim. So if we're just trying to learn lines for a play over and over again, we might say these lines and trying to drill them into our brains, kind of brand them into our memories. Now, that kind of learning is not the type of learning that we usually want from students. Sometimes they do need to learn things verbatim. Sometimes they do need to learn lines of text, but mostly we want them to actually understand and connect what we're teaching them with what they already know. And that falls down that meaningful end of the spectrum. So for students, it's really important that they understand that they can learn things rote if they want to, but it's not going to be as good for them. If they try to brand it onto their brains, they'll actually be more likely to forget it than if they spend time and use techniques to try to connect it to what they already know, that meaningful side of the continuum. So we want them to understand that they need to be motivated to learn meaningfully, and that means connecting things to what they already know. What do we want them to understand about the benefits of meaningful learning? Why is it beneficial if they exert this effort to connect ideas to what they already know? Well, if they learn meaningfully, they can grow bodies of knowledge. And that's what they're aiming to do. In each of the subjects and topics that you teach them, they're wanting to grow vast amounts of connected knowledge. In neuroscience, we talk about it in terms of schema. Ajubel talks about it in terms of bodies of knowledge. Here's a very brief example. You can see from this very, very small example that a body of knowledge has these kind of bigger concepts and it's connected to the information, it's organized. Now, if a student had knowledge that looks a bit like this, it's what kind of things does that help them do? Well, we can see that it's nice and stable, it's connected in a network. If you grow bodies of knowledge, our pupils have got stable knowledge. And stable knowledge is what we want. We don't want them forgetting things straight away. It's also accessible. If I start to talk to them about any one of the branches of their knowledge, they'll be able to access information related to it. And it allows us to store vast bodies of knowledge, vast amounts of knowledge. So having things connected up in this way means students can store more. Imagine the opposite of this with rote learning. If each of these ideas was disconnected, they're not going to be able to access the knowledge in the same way. It's not going to be as stable, and it's far harder to recall lots of individual bits of information. What they're aiming for is bodies of connected knowledge, and that can only be achieved through meaningful learning when we connect what we know already to the new material. So what are the ingredients for meaningful learning? What do students actually have to do to achieve this meaningful learning? They've got to listen. They've got to take in the information you're teaching them or that they are reading, for example. They've got to be prepared. They've got to have relevant prior knowledge ready and available as they're listening to or reading the new material. Now, we can definitely, as teachers, help them with this, but I think it's important for them to know that these things have to be in place for meaningful learning to take place. And they have a responsibility to do these things. So they have a responsibility to listen. They have a responsibility to try to connect their prior knowledge to what they already know. So they need to have that prior knowledge available and listen to the teacher when the teacher is trying to activate it. And finally, crucially, they have to connect their prior knowledge to the new material. So how do we support it? And what do students need to do? Well, the listen element is about our behaviour management, about how we create those conditions in the classroom so that students can focus. The prepared element, now this is about students having the prior knowledge available. This is about how we sequence the curricula that we teach. It's about how we begin the lesson to activate that kind of prior knowledge and check that it's there. Now, I think that students bear a big responsibility for this portion. If they can understand that they have to activate their prior knowledge and connect it to what they know, then there are certain things that they need to really engage with. Imagine you've just given a really in-depth explanation about something. You need to make explicit links between what students already know and the new material that you're teaching them. You as a teacher have the responsibility to make those links to support students to understand and learn meaningfully. Students need to understand that if you give them time for this thing called self-explanation, they need to really engage with that. That is a crucial part of meaningful learning. They need to ask themselves, what did I take from that explanation? And obviously as teachers, we check, don't we? We check what they've taken from it to make sure that they have understood it. But they bear a strong responsibility to engage with that, because that is meaningful learning, trying to connect what they already know to what you've just said. Finally, elaboration. And this is really important. They can do the self-explanation and they can say what they've taken from it. And then they've got to try to link it into that body of knowledge that they already have. How does this new meaning that I've taken from my teacher's explanation, how does that fit with what I already know? Does it conflict with anything? Am I confused about anything? There's a real metacognitive element here to meaningful learning. And I think that students, knowing that this is how their memories work, understanding that they're trying to grow bodies of knowledge, they need to do these things. Finally, I'm going to talk to you about forgetting. What do we mean by forgetting? Well, if we learn things meaningfully, we've connected prior knowledge to new ideas and we've formed a new meaning. If we've learnt in that way, rather than in a more rote fashion, then forgetting happens by losing detail. So we've formed this lovely new meaning. We want to keep hold of it, but over time, the new meaning absorbs into our prior knowledge and we lose the detail of the new meaning. The new meaning becomes inaccessible. And that is how forgetting happens if we've learned things meaningfully. Sometimes we don't mind losing some of the detail of what we've learned, that new meaning, but sometimes we need to keep hold of it. And either way, we kind of need to track how that detail is being lost in our students' minds, because we don't want them conflating two concepts because they have lost the detail of the new concept that they learnt. So for example, if they're learning about conduction and convection, and they learned about conduction first, and then they learned about convection, and those two things sort of became one, then we'd start to confuse the two concepts unless we keep the detail about convection alive. So what we want to do is we want to keep a track of the lost detail in our students' memories, and we want them to take responsibility for keeping track of that lost detail as well. A friend of mine, Christian Still, on Twitter, has a really nice, I think, technique for tracking lost detail, but creating that metacognitive element to it as well. So this is how Christian does it. He gets them to mark their own work and track their lost detail. So if it's anything less than that double tick, they will add in the lost detail that they've had. And he draws their attention to the fact that detail is kind of getting lost and getting forgotten, and they need to check back in on their memories to make sure that that detail stays alive. So this is what we want. We want to keep meaning alive. What techniques can we use to try to keep this meaning alive? Retrieval. Retrieval practice is an incredible way of strengthening our memories. We still need to check as we retrieve that we haven't lost some of those details, but retrieval can be really good for consolidating our memories. So what we want our students to be doing is low stakes tests, engaging in low stakes tests in the classroom with us, but also doing it for homework and doing it themselves, and understanding that they have to check back in with their memories and that they have to do things. They have the power to do things to change their memories, as we talked about at the beginning, makes it hopefully more likely that they would then engage in retrieval practice. And we want it spaced over time. They don't need to be retrieving things every single day. They want to wait for a little bit of forgetting to set in, and then they want to retrieve, because forming these bodies of knowledge should be effortful. We talked earlier about that importance of it being effortful, those connections. So understanding that things should be effortful means alarm bells are ringing if things seem really easy to them. Things should be challenging, and spacing retrieval over time adds in that effort. So again, it's my belief that if we can change the metaphor for memory that our students have, and we can get rid of the library metaphor and we can put in the ecosystem metaphor, and they can understand that their memories are dynamic, which means they don't stay the same. They need to keep checking in on them. They're adaptive. We can create the conditions. The students themselves can create the conditions to actually make their memories thrive, and their memories are interconnected. And that takes effort, and they need to effortfully create those connections in order to learn meaningfully. Okay, so I think Terry had some questions for me to answer, so I'm just going to run through some of the questions, and they were about misconceptions around memory. So ideas that people have about memory that might not be true. And I put out a Twitter thread the other day about 3 misconceptions that I think that people have about memory. So I'm just going to run through some of those misconceptions, as Terry asked some questions about it very kindly. So the first one was one that we've already spoken about. So that's the idea that experiencing something means we've learned it. And that's that library metaphor again, creeping in. The idea that we should have just banked the information. And we've talked about how that's not the case, that memory is dynamic, it's always changing, and that we need to connect it to what we already know in order to learn it. And I think the key takeaway there for us is that, and for our students, is that learning is a process, not an event. So actually, we need to be seeing learning over the long term as a process, a development, rather than just something that either happens or doesn't. Secondly, there is something you hear reasonably often, is that students don't need to learn facts. They can just Google them. Now, this is a really seductive misconception, because we know we can just Google information. Like, that's definitely true. And it's really helped us. It's benefited us. It's benefited the way we learn and the way we think. However, being able to Google something is not the same as learning it. We've talked about how learning involves a connection between the information and what you already know. Googling something does not create that connection. You have to actually cognitively, actively do something with that information to be able to turn it into knowledge in your brain. So just think about it from this perspective. If all we wanted students to do was parrot facts back at us, then yes, they could just Google it. But actually think about the processes, the difficult processes, the analysing of texts, the evaluating of ideas that you want students to do in your subject, the ways you want them to think. Now, that doesn't bear any resemblance to just being able to type something in and get an answer from it. And if we want those ways of thinking, then the information needs to make its way into long-term memory, into these bodies of knowledge. And the way that they do that is through effortful cognitive processing. So yes, we can just Google facts. Students can just Google facts. But do we want students who just parrot facts back at us? Or do we want students who think with facts that have been carefully curated and are part of this meaningful body of knowledge? And I think the answer is that's what we want. So yes, we can just Google things, but no, that doesn't lead to the meaningful learning that we want for our students. And then finally, I think that people think that forgetting is the enemy of learning. And I can see why, because you're trying to remember something and you can't, and it's in there somewhere and you can't access it. So I completely understand why people would think it was the enemy of learning. However, if we learn things meaningfully, forgetting is actually a really interesting process, because forgetting is where ideas become assimilated, so much so that we start to lose a bit of detail, but we also gain loads from that assimilation process. So what we get is we get ideas kind of like merging together. And I gave the image of like cooking a stew and the ingredients and how they kind of come together to create these like new flavors. Well, that happens during the forgetting process. Ideas are kind of coming together, and yes, we lose some detail, but we're actually gaining a greater understanding by merging those two ideas. So we certainly want to track lost detail, just as we talked about just now. But we also want to remember that forgetting is a good thing. The time that we spend, our brains kind of spend like merging ideas, creates understanding, and we want to harness the power of that. So that means that we kind of teach efficiently. We don't need to revisit ideas a few minutes later. We need to let forgetting set in a little bit before we get students to retrieve and revisit. So thanks very much for having me for your keynote, and I hope you have a great day. I know Ollie Lovell is talking to you as well, and that guy's great. He's got so much wisdom. So I hope that goes really well, and I hopefully get to speak to you again in the future.